was born in 1975, so I was born 2 years after the coup. But certainly, as some of you may know, the now infamous video footage and photos of the bombing of La Moneda. So La Moneda is the presidential palace that sits in Santiago, where Allende was with a small group of friends and colleagues, which at one point he gave them all the right to leave. He said, you don't have to stay with me. I am going to stay here because the people of Chile voted me in, so it's only the people of Chile that will remove me. So he decided to stay in the palace the day that the bomb started coming down, and said to his people, his supporters, his friends, family, his daughter was also with him, you can leave. And many of them chose to stay with him, including his daughter. And one of the people that did leave, which he asked, specifically said, please leave, was Juan Garcés. And Juan Garcés would then play a very important part of history, because when Pinochet is then arrested in 1998 in London, it is actually Juan Garcés, who's working as a lawyer in Spain, that helps to build the case against him all those years later. And he talks in an interview about when Allende asks him to leave, he says, you need to leave because you need to tell the world what happened here today. So Allende dies in the palace that day, along with other compañeros, and then some people arrested and taken out of there. And those images were beamed out. There was, at the time, there was a group, I think there were students of East Germans that was in Chile at the time, because they were filming this revolutionary movement that was happening in Chile. Now, there were many people that went to Chile during Allende's time, including people like Jeremy Corbyn, etc., that wanted to see for themselves what was happening in Chile. And there was these East German, I don't know if they're filmmakers or film students, but either way, they were filming what was happening and managed to get footage of what would happen in La Moneda, and actually what would then happen in the stadium. And they got this footage out, as well as Patricio Guzman, who also got some footage out. And this gets beamed across the world, really, and the images that we know today. And as my dad was saying, I mean, this had been pre-planned, so the repression was immediate. The repression started before the coup. The general of the army that had supported Allende, because he was pro-constitution, he was very much a believer in the constitution, and believed if the government needed to be changed, he would just change it at the next election. General Schneider was killed before the coup. So it's very much, it was in the making, obviously. So the wheels of repression came in full force, obviously, from the day of the coup onwards. The football stadium, the National Football Stadium, was turned into a torture camp, and that's where we see thousands of people being put inside of there, including Victor Jara, which some of you may know his songs. Victor Jara had been part of this popular movement, new song movement that my dad was just speaking about. And he was very symbolic. He was very young. He was very charismatic. The ladies loved him. He was, a very powerful figure in the sense that he came from a very humble background. So his songs were about the everyday struggles in Chile. It was about the shantytown. It was about the children that was growing up in very poor conditions, but about the hope that Allende's government had brought them. So his killing in the stadium was very symbolic, and he was singled out, and they made him play his guitar, then broke his hands, then shot him. And that's just an example of the kind of the mental repression that also comes from physical repression, the use of fear. And this was something, obviously, that continued throughout the 17 years of the dictatorship. And actually, only last week, I think it was, there was an autopsy, the investigations into Victor Jara's murder were concluded, and he was shot 44 times. So the repression kicked in. There's hundreds of secret torture centres opened, and hundreds of concentration camps opened. And the methods used were horrific. And we always knew that the methods had come from the School of Americas. We knew that the School of the Americas used Nazi inspired torture methods, but there's also this, now we know this history of the French being involved with the torture methods that were used in the Indochina and the Battle of Algiers. These are then transported to Latin America, first to Brazil, then to Chile, Argentina, and expanded across the cone under Operation Condor. So actually in Chile, many of the people that disappeared, and we've got still over 1,000 disappeared, many of them were known to be thrown from planes and helicopters over the sea. Well, that method was first done by the French in the Battle of Algiers and in Indochina. So these are direct transportation of torture methods that are used in the other side of the world to battle against. So at the time it was battling against the red fear, isn't it, communism. But actually that wasn't what was happening in Chile, and that certainly wasn't what the people that were rounded up were. There were obviously all political parties were banned, trade unions were banned, and as you've just heard, the movement was mass. It wasn't just political parties, it was peasants, it was students, it was community workers, it was shantytown dwellers. So everybody was targeted that had been in any way sympathetic to Allende. So as part of the repression, exile is used by the state to get rid of its opponents. And we see from the very first days of the coup, people crossing the border to get out initially, and also people being able to find refuge in embassies. So the Venezuelan embassy opened its doors immediately. You see people going to the Italian embassy, I think it was a Swiss embassy as well. Hundreds of people culminated in these embassies. And they also begin to be targeted by the military because they know that there's people hiding in there. And obviously in a country like Chile, the first thing you do is cross the border. So people fled into Argentina, people fled into Peru. Sadly, what happened to some people is 1973, the coup in Chile, they flee into Argentina. Argentina, 1976, the military coup there. So people who were fleeing the repression of Chile end up being caught up in the repression of Argentina. And as we now know, these regimes, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Chile, Brazil, create Operation Condor, which is this transnational network of secret police and state security agents tracking down the dissidents. And that doesn't just happen in the Southern Cone. That repression is transported to Europe and, in fact, even Washington. So before 9/11, the first bomb to explode in the United States of foreign intervention is actually the car bomb that kills Orlando Letelier and his assistant Moffat in a car bomb in Washington. Orlando Letelier had been the ambassador to Chile, a great friend of Allende, and when the dictatorship happens, he flees, goes to the United States, and straight away starts mobilizing support, speaks at the UN, starts talking to a lot of congressmen within the United States, so he becomes a target of Operation Condor, and he's killed on US soil, along with Ronnie Moffat, his assistant. And we also see the targeting of Prats and his wife in Italy.
No, Argentina.
In Argentina.
Leighton in Italy.
Yep, and then we see a targeting of people in Italy. So we see, the tentacles of this systemic repression go across the globe. And certainly I remember as a young child, after we arrived, going to the Chilean embassy because we had to do some documents, and my parents telling all of us, the three of us back then, to put our hoods up over our heads and not look at the cameras, because we were very aware that actually the Pinochet's regime could even reach us in the UK. And documentation shows that was real. That wasn't, a paranoia of our parents or of our community. So the repression is vast, and thousands of people leave or are forced to leave. So political exile is used by Pinochet's regime, as a repressive tool in itself. There's poetry written about exile being worse than death, in the sense that people are forced to leave everything. And certainly in our case, my mum and dad were forced to leave their families with 3 young children, and in our case, never to return again. And the Chilean exile is vast. So if you think that Chile at the time of the coup probably only had about 11 million people, it's a small country in terms of its population. The estimates of exiles is anything between 200,000, which is the official figures, up to 2 million. And so if you think 2 million is a large percentage of 11 million, and because you count in then the families and the extended family that then has to leave as well, because they can then become a target. And Chileans were exiled over to 119 countries across the world. I mean, we went everywhere. To say the numbers are quite small, Chileans are everywhere. And in fact, one of Allende Leteli's son once wrote, I think it's Juan Pablo, wrote about the solidarity. He said, there's no one important city in the world that hasn't had an empanada eaten in it. Because the Chilean exiles arrive, like my parents, like Gilberto, and immediately start becoming politically active. I mean, in some cases, literally from prison to plane, to getting off the plane in the host country, to becoming politically active straight away. The international response to Chile's coup is incredible. It's incredible, and it's still something as Chileans we're still amazed by that. Even today, all these years later, people like yourselves coming out and taking your Saturday afternoon out to listen to us. And Chile, in that sense, is quite unique. It's not unique, but it's distinct. Why did what was happening in Chile touch so many people's lives outside of Chile? And the solidarity movement begins straight away, and certainly in the UK, within days of the coup, people start organising. You see the creation of Chile Solidarity Campaign, and in the people. So, I've now, funnily enough, ended up researching the solidarity movement, obviously out of personal interest and lived experience. I was the child running around in these solidarity events, similar age to my son now, and I was always fascinated by how people responded to us and come together to support us. So I've spoken to people of London, I've spoken to people in Northampton, in Cambridge, in Sheffield, in Rotherham, and immediately people wanted to do something and start organising at grassroots level, not necessarily waiting for a campaign to be created, but just meeting up with people at the Labour Club, or amongst their shop steward with their union branch, or in their church group, and etc., and start talking about how they can help. And academics have written about what was it about the Chilean exile experience that made it different. Why do we have now this long tradition, strong history of solidarity? And one of the things that they point out is the dictatorship lasted a long time. It lasts until 1990, 17 years. So it's a long time by which people start to get to know Chileans and organise around what's happening there. The high number of countries that received Chileans also obviously plays a part in that. So there's a Chile Solidarity event that's gone on in most cities across the world, hence the quote about empanadas. But also the exiles themselves, their generation was so visible because they were so active. Became involved in the local trade unions, in the local universities, and the universities that they end up studying, alongside community organisations, alongside campaigns. And one of the things I think that is very interesting about that solidarity movement is it becomes two ways. So I distinctly remember in Sheffield and Rotherham going to events and helping fundraise for the miners' strike of 84 and 85. Going to events about South Africa, supporting the anti-apartheid movement, going to events about Palestine. I've interviewed people that remember as children going to Greenham Common with their mum, and doing the chain around, the famous chain that was done. I remember going to demos against Thatcher's cuts. I remember going to London on a coach from Rotherham to say goodbye to the GLC when that was closed down. by Thatcher's government. So there was this two-way street. Because many Chileans have been politicised by much of the history and the movements that my dad was talking about, they know what it is to give solidarity as well as receive. They know what it is that this new wave of this new form of economic model, which is now known as neoliberalism, they knew what it was going to bring because they saw what it did to Chile. And obviously, 1979, Thatcher is voted in, and the same economic model that we get by the bullet, you get by the ballot box. And this privatising of industries, the deregulation of the state, the primacy given to the financial industry, the complete stripping of the welfare state, etc., are very similar to the struggles that the Chileans are now facing. So you see this relationship building on, which I would argue is maintained to this day. Hence today's meeting, really. So there's a solidarity campaign set up in over 80 countries, and even groups like Amnesty International. So in 1974, Amnesty International has 3,000 members. By 1976, it has 50,000 members. So you get even these NGOs that we now know growing during that period when people's awareness has grown. And like I said, the exiles play their own special role in building that solidarity and working to support the resistance which continues in Chile. So the resistance doesn't stop when the last concentration camp is closed in the late 70s. It continues, as does the repression. So some people will say, well, the repression was mainly at the beginning of Pinochet's regime. That's just simply not true. And we know that isn't true because when Pinochet is arrested in 1998, the exile community gets together once more and starts to campaign for his extradition to Spain. And part of those legal proceedings, the law lords rule that Pinochet can face trial for crimes against humanity, but not for any crimes before 1988. Does anybody know or want to hazard a guess why 1988 is significant in British law?
The transition begins.
Well, 1998 is when Thatcher finally signs the Torture Convention on Human Rights. She'd refused to sign it till then.
Yeah.
And the belief is because she didn't want to face, or anybody to face, any cases for Britain's role in Northern Ireland, which is another solidarity event that I remember going to. So she doesn't sign it till 1988. And we're not allowed to bring any cases or have any cases against Pinochet before 1988. So the exile community spring into action and look for cases post 1988, and we find them, and horrific cases as well. One of the cases we found was actually in Sheffield. So the idea that the repression and it's against a woman, horrific sexual violence. So the idea that the repression somehow petered out is just simply not true. But despite of this, the Chileans carry on resisting, and we have waves of this resistance happening in Chile, and we have in, let me just double check, el 86 or el 84.
86.
Yeah, in 1986 we have the attempted murder of Pinochet, which is unfortunately unsuccessful, but shows about how strong the resistance again had come by Frente Patriótica. So these networks that become formed during those times of the solidarity events are then reactivated in years to come, years following the end of the dictatorship. One is the 1998 campaign to try and get him extradited. And people forget that actually by the time Jack Straw, Labour government, decides to send Pinochet back and not face trial in Spain, by the time that happens, 4 European countries are asking for his extradition. So it's Spain, France, Belgium and Switzerland. And in those countries, it's the exiled community, along with the families of the disappeared and the executed and the tortured, that have done that work in those countries to build a case. against Pinochet. And shamefully, the country that had him decides not to prosecute him, because we also went to the CPS with our case against Pinochet to get him tried here, and the case is turned down. But that shows the mass mobilisation of the exile community all these years later in terms of trying to fight for his extradition. And this is a solidarity network that then is reactivated for the 40th anniversary of the coup in 2013. So we have people like Unite the Union supporting our activities then, which back then was TNG and WU, which were the ones that in Northampton in the 70s and 80s, the truckers refused to carry any goods, Chilean goods, to Liverpool to be docked, to be put onto the Liverpool, to ships from Liverpool. The dockers in Liverpool refused to load any Chilean goods because, you know, they were saying, we're not supporting the junta, we're not supporting the killing of Chilean compañeros and compañeras. And for those of you who've seen Ne Pasarán, and if you haven't, I'd strongly advise you to see it, a very beautiful film about the workers in East Kilbride, which work in the Rolls-Royce factory there, receive engines of the Harrier Hunter jets, the Hunter jets that were used to bomb La Moneda, the 11th of September, asked to work on them by the Chilean military, and they refused to touch them. And they have a standoff of years, which is even brought up in the House of Commons. The Chilean government are fuming, the British government are fuming, because obviously they're friends of Pinochet, but the shop stewards and the union members refused to, they literally blacked them and refused to work them. And the film shows how actually they ended up taking them out in the middle of the night, because when they said, well, the Chileans said in the end, well, if all right, if you're not going to work on them, you know, nearly 3 years later, you might as well just send them back in whatever state they're in. And they'd made sure that the state they were going to send back, they were going to be unworkable. And the workers said, well, we're not touching them, so we can't move them. So in the middle of the night, they moved by unmarked vehicles, and they must have been sent back by the RAF airports, because we've seen letters where the airport workers have refused to handle them as well. So you see this, you know, whole chain of, or network of ordinary men and women, British men and women, as workers, putting down their tools and saying, we're not in any shape or form partaking in the support of this regime, and actually will actively work against anything you do to work with them. And those stories are repeated across the country, even down to a simple example of when we arrived in this country in 1978. We're initially housed in a hotel in Notting Hill, which says a lot about Notting Hill in the 1970s, because I don't think they'd have a refugee hotel there then, so now somehow. And then Rotherham Council offer some houses to Chilean refugees, and that's how we end up in Rotherham, most glamorous of places, in the 70s especially. And we end up in Rotherham, and when we arrive in Sheffield Station, Pond Street, we get off that coach, we're met by a social worker that the Rotherham Council appoint to support the Chileans resettle, and I don't think he's a shop steward, steel worker shop steward, young man, who literally is told by his union, go to Pond Street such and such day, go and meet Chileans. And he became a long time family friend. Charlie Simmons is still a friend of ours. You know, and he talks about very beautifully about how, you know, we're always saying thank you to him for what he did and the union did for us, and he always says, Maria, you changed our lives. Changed our lives. I learned Spanish. I made lifelong friends. And he said when he laughs because I always repeat this story, but to me it just symbolises what political activism is about. He said, Maria, when your dad got off that coach in Pond Street that day, I held out my hand to shake it, to greet him. I didn't even know Spanish, your dad didn't know English, I just held out the hand, you know, the universal greeting. And your dad brushed it away and hugged me. Oh. And he said, and I'm a Yorkshire man, I'd never been hugged in my life. And it changed my life. It changed my life. And I think that's what You know, one of the things that we're trying to remember with the 50th, we're trying to, you know, in our 50th year commemoration, of course it's about remembering about the terrible things that happened. It's about honouring the people that are no longer with us. It's about naming the disappeared, because they still need to be found. Those families deserve to know where they are and have a grave to visit. But it's also about celebrating that solidarity and that humanity that I think people don't realise outside of political circles, activist circles, what being political is really about. It's about extending that hand or hugging that person in their time of need and standing with them in that demonstration and eating that empanada. And in my work as a PhD, one of the things that I'm exploring is the impact that that has had. And I'm pointing to you all and to Gilberto and my dad and my mum, the impact that what you built had on the second generation. Because to me, that's what integration is about. I felt integrated in British society, not because I was forced to learn English, not because I had to learn what British values were, whatever they are supposed to be, universal values, I'd argue, not because I had to stand in front of a flag and pledge allegiance, but because I grew up in political meetings and events and concerts and demos, surrounded by ordinary British people that were willing to stand there with us. And that, I think, is the true legacy of Pinochet's dictatorship, and a legacy that no doubt would make him turn in his grave if he knew that today.